This book is called Beyond Biofeedback. It's by Elmer and Alice Green of the Menninger Foundation. Comment by Gardner Murphy. Introduction. Miracles do not happen in contradiction to nature, but only in contradiction to which is known to us about nature. St. Augustine. This book is not a scientific document or a review of biofeedback and self-awareness training programs, or an autobiography, or a travelogue, or a long essay on philosophy and metaphysics, but it is partially all of these. Every chapter bears on questions that all humans raise at one time or another. Who are we? What can we do to shape the events in our lives so that we can develop our talents and live joyfully? Two questions involve self-identity and volition, the subject of this book. In working with patients, we have noticed that our having developed a limited skill at philosophical self-regulation encourages them. If you can do it, maybe I can. Seems to be their unexpressed feeling, something like the motto found at the front of a popular text on algebra. What one fool can do, so can another. We have decided, therefore, to tell not only about our research, but about ourselves and explain how the study of consciousness and volition became our main interest. By the end of this book, we hope it will seem obvious, or at least highly plausible, that psychology and parapsychology are part of a more generalized psychology, that medicine and spiritual healing can be parts of a more general medicine, and that physics and psychophysics are literally parts of a more general physics. In considering these pairs pragmatically, psychology and parapsychology, medicine and spiritual healing, and physics and psychophysics, it is necessary to give mind a role in nature that has heretofore not been acceptable in modern science. Some scientists do not like this, but there is no way to avoid it. The evidence is overwhelming and can no longer be ignored. In the 21st century, it will be taken for granted by every school child that mind and matter, both inside and outside the skin, have something in common. In a way, this book is a preview of what we will think scientifically studied in the coming century. A significant factor in the science will be self-awareness. If the old model must be scrapped, what is to take its place? Some scientists who realize that the old model is finished have viewed with alarm the chaos that the new ideas are injecting into scientific thought. However, the fact that mind can influence both body and nature does not usually have any revolutionary effects in our lives. If we fall off a ladder, we do not really care that Newton was not exactly correct. For all practical purposes, he was right, and his description of the law of gravity fits the case quite closely. In the same way, even though our understanding of mind and nature and their interaction may open new possibilities for self-direction and volition, and for freedom of spirit, we still must send our children to school, pay taxes, earn a living, and do everything else that mundane life demands. The most significant difference the new concept makes is in our self-image. As we begin to realize that there are not only the victims of our genetics, conditioning, and accidents, changes begin to happen in our lives, nature begins to respond to us in a new way, and the things that we visualize, even though unlikely, begin to happen with increasing frequency. This also is what this book is about. Biofeedback training has to do with the way in which the body responds to thoughts and feelings. Beyond biofeedback has to do with mind and nature. The body seems to be a special case of nature in general and is essentially a test tube in which we can practice the control of energies that are a part of nature. If these ideas seem unlikely, it is because we have inhibited, repressed, and hypnotized our cultural conditioning and education to see ourselves as powerless to control or change events in our bodies and lives. In psychology, there has been a tendency to look on humans as king-size rats, reflective only of genetics and conditioning. In medicine, we have accepted the idea that the doctor must cure us. In order to be made well, we must undergo surgery, drug treatment, radiation treatment, or some other kind of manipulation by outside forces. We have not been informed that our bodies tend to do what they are told if we know how to tell them. The laws of nature are seen by most scientists, the priests of today, as not connected in any way with the mind. The matter without mind concept is mass hypnosis, mass illusion, according to the people who have developed unusual physiological and psychophysical capacities. And only when we do not accept this limiting image of ourselves, we can break the thraldom and begin to operate as free beings, capable of influencing to a significant extent the course of our lives. Having said this, we recognize that freedom is nevertheless conditional. Freedom here means that fraction of control potentially available in us to help bring genetic predisposition and previous conditioning under self-control. At the beginning of this training in self-regulation, we may be pre-programmed by genetics and conditioning to a large degree, but it is the extent to which we can modify the program that is important, and it is here that we begin. Many adherents of the new existentially based psychologies, humanistic and transpersonal, have become aware of the fact that our civilization is in danger of destroying itself through acceptance of self-limiting ideas that have no basis in fact. Ideas that developed from work of existentially deprived researchers in behavioristic and experimental psychology, and from theories developed from Freud's early views of the unconscious, views that clearly were influenced by Freud's view of himself. Freud and his coterie accumulated massive amounts of data in support of the theoretical position he developed, but later, when he showed interest in parapsychology processes, such ideas were rejected by many of his followers. Freud was more flexible than his admirers. He has reported to have said that if he were to live his life over again, he would also be interested in studying the parapsychological phenomena of non-sensory communication that he had experienced with certain patients. Jungian psychology also reflected the experience of its founder, Carl Jung, but since from the very start, his awareness included much direct parapsychological experience. He naturally had a different view of human beings than Freud did. The point here is that the ideas people tend to develop of psychology and nature depend to a large extent upon the people's own experiences, the theoretical ramifications of their philosophies, however large, seldom transcend the limits of their own existential base. So in order to make our position clear, we will interweave our own experience and the existential story with the academic and research story. If there is a message in this book, it is that the development of individuals and of the race depends on the extent to which consciousness and volition are studied and used. Citizens of the future will be relatively free, we believe, from simple behavioristic concepts that promote a defeatist self-image. With a new view of themselves and nature, individuals will be able to develop more easily those capacities and creative potentials that lead from knowledge to wisdom. With that, we begin and hope the reader will find the trip interesting. Chapter 2, Roots and Sources. The divorce between scientific facts and religious facts may not necessarily be eternal as it is first seems. The rigorous impersonal view of science might one day appear as having been a useful eccentricity rather than the definite triumph position which the sectarian scientist at present so confidently announces it to be. William James. This book is a joint adventure. From this point on, italics are used to indicate that the writer is Alice Elmer's text in Roman type. Everything that is written, however, is really a joint production. We have discussed and sometimes debated every idea in detail, regardless of who has written about it. And we have edited and modified each other's material freely. In this chapter, we share something of our personal backgrounds, some of Elmer's experiences that led, while he was still in high school, to an interesting in the unconscious are included here. Other experiences that are particularly appropriate to the development or restatement of the field of mind theory are included later in chapter 14. My background, which includes experiences with unconventional healing, often called spiritual healing, is also saved for inclusion later where it seems most appropriate. Several years before I met Alice in Minneapolis, my mother, father, brother, and I had become aware of what we refer to as mental telepathy. Parapsychological events at our home in Duluth, Minnesota now seem commonplace compared to present-day reports, but at the time they were quite impressive. For instance, on more than one occasion, my mother got inexplicably correct ideas about the events and lives of my brother and myself. It was disconcerting to us for her to know about someone we had met before we had told anyone about him. It was she who stimulated our interest in and awareness of improbable coincidences. For a while, I kept records of such occurrences. Record keeping seemed to have an awareness sharpening effect, and I was amazed to note how much I was functioning or making decisions with information that was normally unconscious. On one occasion, I had a dream in which, while walking on a featureless gray plain under a uniformly gray sky, I met the brother of a friend, John Farron. This brother, Jerry, had joined the Navy and was stationed at San Diego, California. When we met in the dream, I asked how he was feeling, and he gave me a long, detailed description of the trouble he had been having with an infection in his leg. He was all right now, he had said, but it had been a bad experience. I wished him well, and he continued on his way. The image of Jerry was so vivid that I was jolted from the semi-awareness into full awakeness. The next day I told John about the dream, and he said that his mother was worried because Jerry's regular weekly letters had not come for a month. A week later, John called and said a letter had just come from Jerry. He had been in the hospital for a month with an infected leg, resulting in 30 or 40 boils, but he was almost well and was being discharged. He had been so uncomfortable that he could not even write home. Events of that kind stimulated lots of a discussion in my family, and we often debated the meaning and interpretation of psychic experiences. We also argued about related questions such as what behavior is appropriate if you perceive that something of an unpleasant nature may happen to a friend. Should you say nothing? Should you say something? In another vein, what does psychism have to do with religion? When I was a senior in high school, my mother became very much interested in a series of talks on psychic phenomena, and she and I joined a study group conducted by Arthur J. Green, a traveling lecturer. Arthur Green had been a religious minister on the West Coast for many years, and eventually under the tutelage of Jacques Romanos, a renowned Englishman, he had begun the study of mind-body coordination. According to Arthur, Romano had been trained by Sufis. He had run away from home when he was 9 years old, shipping as cabin boy on a freighter bound for Egypt. In Cairo, Arthur told me Jacques had jumped ship and met some Sufis who apprenticed him to a teacher. His last stage of training at age 16 consisted of living alone and eating only dates at a secluded oasis until, among other things, conversational telepathic communication was established with his teacher. After that, he returned to England. He was educated as a chemist and began teaching the Sufi philosophy. Whatever the details of Jacques Romano's early life, my mother met him when he toured the United States at about age 75. She told me that he had an appearance of a much younger man. On a radio program before returning to England, he impressed both the doctors who examined him and the radio audience, who could hear the flubbed-up heart sound amplified from the stethoscope by obliterating his pulse. One of Arthur's major percepts learned from Jacques Romano sounds familiar today. If you feel that you know a truth, you must be able to demonstrate it in your life to some degree. Otherwise, you don't really know it. You are only talking. It is not interesting that this is what we're told 40 years later by Don Juan, the Yaqui Indian whose teachings were put in a book form by Carlos Castaneda. When I first met Arthur Green, I was studying physics in high school and was thoroughly imbued and permeated with scientific method. At the same time, I was hearing Arthur Green say, in addition to a scientific view of nature in physics and chemistry, we must add second-order corrections. These have to do with the power of mind to influence body and nature. To me, this was a startling idea. Arthur discussed the brain and its electrochemical impulses as if, in some way, yet to be discovered. There were brain patterns associated with thinking and with telepathy. This was just a few years after Hans Berger in Germany had discovered brain rhythms in his own fruitless search for an explanation of mental telepathy. According to Arthur Green, the two most significant features of Sufism were control of the body, emotions, and mind, and aligning oneself with nature. If these were done successfully, then one's visualizations of events tended to be followed by a compliance in nature. There was another kind of problem, however, the need to determine what visualizations could be morally constructed. In order to work morally with nature, it is necessary to know what nature approves of, and then to tell nature through visualization what nature wants. In this context, humans seems to be transmitters of intention, the agents of action, rather than the sole determiners of action. Again, according to Sufi theory, everyone works at two paradoxical levels simultaneously, that of appearances and that of causes, though what we call causes themselves seem to result from a more subtle causes, a sort of wheels within wheels phenomenon, or as Julius Stolman has expressed in it, the title of journal, fields within fields within fields. From Arthur Green, I have learned the rudiments of two valuable techniques of mind-body coordination for dealing with physical and psychological problems. The first was a meditation technique similar to autogenic training, discussed in chapter 3, in which one becomes quiet and then visualizes the desired change in physiological state. One of the participants in Arthur Green's study group mentioned one day that she remembered that he had white hair several years ago, but now it was brown. He explained that he had learned a visualization system for bringing about changes in the body and had decided to return his hair to its original color. It took 7 long years to accomplish that change, he said. But after he started, he did not want to stop. He felt that it was necessary to complete his demonstration, which required a daily visualization, but he would never make such an attempt again. It isn't worth it to take time for such an important purpose. Such an unimportant purpose. The second technique that we learned from Arthur Green brought results of striking nature in the domain of imagery. It consisted of method for getting answers from the unconscious. At that time, I was reading a book by Professor L.T. Troland of Harvard called Mystery of Mind, 1926. And while I read about synapses and neurological transmission of impulses for perception, I experimented with Arthur Green's technique of getting verifiable answers from the unconscious. Both claimed to be empirical systems and therefore assumed that they related in some way, though no one seemed to know anything about such a relationship. The psychological basis of Sufi theory includes the idea that at an unconscious level, all human minds are parts of one general mind, an idea somewhat similar to Carl Jung's concept of the collective racial unconscious. In Sufi theory, we may see ourselves as separate and think inside our own heads, so to speak, but our heads encase brains that are the organs of perception not only of sensory inputs from the world of physical substance, but also of sensory inputs from the worlds of other kinds of substance, substances quite different from those studied in the chemist's test tube. In writing about it now, the technique sounds complex, but it is nevertheless simple. The directions are: write 3 times on the outside of an envelope the sentence, "My subconscious mind, please answer this question for me at once." Then write on a sheet of paper a question whose answer can be verified objectively, along with an instruction to the mind concerning how to answer. For instance, will the second Thursday of January 1999 fall on an even numbered date? If so, please give me a symbol of motors. Fold the paper several times so that the questions cannot be seen and seal it in the prepared envelope. Next, find someone who is willing to participate in the experiment, someone who does not object to the idea of dreaming about the contents of the envelope and writing the dream down on awakening. On going to bed, he should put the envelope under the pillow and say 3 times, "My subconscious mind, please answer this question for me at once." The unconscious might not provide dreams about motors on the first night, and if no such dream is recorded, the experiment is repeated the next night, with the question rephrased to ask about an odd number, or to say, if not, give me a symbol of motors. Sooner or later, motors are dreamed about, and the answer, of course, is subject to verification. Some dreams are literally striking and shock the dreamer to full consciousness. At the University of Minnesota, I chose the symbol of motors and asked a skeptical fraternity brother to dream. When I asked the next day if he had any dreams, which he said were unusual in his life, he said yes, and that it was so odd to have such a sharp dream that he woke up. He was in a powerful motorboat riding across a lake. When he came to a dock, he jumped out of the boat and into the automobile with a big, loud engine and raced to an airport. There he got into a plane and took off into the clouds. In each section of the dream, he was impressed by the loudness of the motor. I laughed, tore open the envelope, and showed him the question. We looked up the answer. It was correct. The fall of 1936, I moved to Minneapolis to enroll in physics department at the University of Minnesota, with the thought that somehow this branch of science might be extended to include the elusive energies that in my mind were associated with telepathy. The world of classical physics proved dull after the heady mixture of theory and practice and self-awareness. However, and after a year and a half at school, I was delighted to learn that the most impressive of all the teachers my mother had met in Duluth was moving to Minneapolis. Dr. Will J. Irwood, who at one time had been a minister in the spiritualistic church. That connection was terminated, he told me, after a sharp disagreement in church councils about psychic phenomenon. His position was that such phenomenon should be given secondary significance, with the emphasis put on spiritual development. After severing connections with the church, he traveled and lectured, as Arthur Green did, visiting many European countries and most of the United States. When Will J., as we call him, moved to Minneapolis in the fall of 1937, I joined his study group on Eastern and Western approaches to self-awareness. Meeting him was an event of major importance. He was jovial, friendly, and warm, and he seemed to know more about me than I had ever disclosed to anyone, though the fact that did not seem to threaten me. He was a cheerful, pink-cheeked, white-haired, blue-eyed Irishman of about medium height, but somewhat more than medium weight, who was extremely psychic when he wanted to be. One day, when I visited him at the Curtis Hotel in Minneapolis, where he often stayed during lecture engagements, he walked to the phone and put his hand on it. In about 5 seconds, it rang. He picked it up, without saying hello, asked, "Did you just get a special delivery letter for me from St. Louis?" There was a pause, and Will J. said, "Oh, I was expecting it, you know." Replacing the phone, he turned with a mischievous grin and said, "You have to be careful and not scare people." In a minute, a bellboy came up with a letter and handed it over with an odd look. When the messenger was gone, I asked, "Will J., how he had known that the letter had just arrived. In the last 15 years, I haven't received a letter or telephone call or visitor without knowing it in advance, he said. The price he paid for that sensitivity was considerable. At one time, he said, his extrasensory awareness of the problems of others was almost more than he could bear. In the same way, perhaps, it is sensitivity to the torments of others that often tortures the lives of psychiatrists. The psychoanalytic theory of transference, in which patients cast their angers and frustrations onto their doctors, may have a substantial basis in psychic energy that must be accepted or rejected or dealt with in some other way. A chapter could be written about this occupational hazard of psychotherapists with reference to Jung, to Reich, and to the new generation of young therapists who speak of bad vibes. Suffice it to say here that if extrasensory perception is a fact, as both Freud and Jung believe, then we might usefully entertain the idea of energy transfer between humans. If information is transmitted, then energy probably is involved, regardless of domain, whether normal or paranormal. Will J. seemed to be a kind of Irish yogi, but he did not develop his skills through the long practice of austerity. Instead, they appeared spontaneously. A believer in reincarnation, he felt that by age 16 he had merely come to himself. His psychic talents had been developed in another life, he felt, and as Will J., he was merely remembering some of his previous abilities. Whatever the explanation, I observed that he had unusual self-regulatory abilities. When he gashed his hand badly with a sharp kitchen knife, it healed completely in a few days, leaving no scar. His explanation was almost identical to what we heard again and again over the years, both in the United States and abroad. The body will do what you tell it if you learn how to tell it. The way of telling it involves quietness plus a visualization of what you want the body to do. I was studying physics rather than physiology, but there was no doubt in my mind that Will J. had unusual powers of physiological self-regulation. More significant to me, though, was his remarkable awareness of others. Over the 8 years in which he and I became very well acquainted, I began to suspect that unusual powers of control over normally involuntary physiological processes, such as self-healing, were accompanied by an awareness of normally unconscious psychological processes, awareness not only of oneself, but others too. Dr. Irwood could go down a row of people in an audience and describe family members and events going back several generations. Since I had, through personal experience, become aware of extrasensory perception, or ESP, I took Will J.'s demonstrations of ESP more or less for granted. What seemed more interesting was the possibility of psychokinesis, PK. Was it possible, as yogis maintain, to influence the physical world by mind alone? I find myself more and more intrigued by the possibility of studying scientifically mind-matter events outside the skin. Control inside one's own body was a special case. Psychic healings were not really adequate evidence of influence of mind over physical world, because some persons with psychosomatic disorders seem to recover from physiological malfunctions in response to a mere gesture from someone they deeply believed in, a doctor, minister, or other healer. Even if we were certain that tissues had been affected, how would we know whether the patient himself had not unconsciously brought about the entire change? Additionally, if ESP was possible, patients might unconsciously modify their own bodies at a suggestion from a healer, even though the healer might be far away. So-called healing at a distance might not be evidence of a direct relationship between mind and matter so much as evidence of a relationship between mind and mind. The problem of proving energy transfer in a study of mind-matter relationships in living beings is formidable because such phenomena are embedded in a welter of so-called spontaneous physiological and electronic noise. It has always seemed to me that the most satisfactory demonstration of energy transfer would necessarily use some kind of inorganic transducer, an inorganic device for converting mental energy into physical energy, analogous to the phonograph cartridge, which converts mechanical vibration into electrical vibration. Furthermore, it must be a device that any person who can focus attention can influence. Psychokinetic phenomenon, although rare, are excellent subjects for investigation because results are observable. Any event in the non-living physical domain can be observed and correlated with a mental event is especially important for construction of a general theory of mind because organic transducers such as plants, animals, and humans have that mysterious ingredient called life, whose properties are at least enigmatic. If a human responds to so-called energy transfer, the theoretical significance of the event is ambiguous because a number of explanations are possible. But if an inorganic body responds to energy that is manipulated, focused, or directed by mind, then a much cleaner theoretical position can be established. Nowadays, with many research subjects, as demonstrated by Uri Geller, objects move and metals bend or break at the request of scientists. Critics may claim sleight of hand by research subjects, but no one who investigates denies that objects are bent. If you try to make your sleeping dog wake up by mental suggestion and he wakes up, it can be argued that he was going to wake up anyway. But with cutlery, it is not easy to say that it was going to bend anyway, right at that time. Parapsychological problems are marvelously intriguing, and I began skipping classes, spending my time reading the literature of psychical research societies of Europe and America. What might have happened if I had continued that way, I cannot say. What did happen was that I met Alice in 1939 and had to face the fact that no employer would pay me to think about psychophysical energies. If we were to get married, which we did in 1941, I would need a job to support a family, so I turned toward more practical studies, and in 1942 graduated with a degree in physics. I immediately took a job at Minneapolis Honeywell, where I worked in instrument development and later as a technical representative with the Air Force during World War II. After the war, I enrolled as a graduate student in physics at UCLA. On the side, I began a study of the retina as a biological energy converter, still thinking, though, of methods for direct detection of psychophysical energies. Money was in short supply for Alice and I were raising 4 children by this time, Pat and Doug from their previous marriage and our own 2, Sandra and Judy. So I left UCLA and took a job as a physicist with the Naval Ordnance Test Station, NOTS, at China Lake, California. Our business was research and development of guided missiles and rockets. My work involved optics, photography, electronics, computing, design of instruments, management of optical research of about 8 physicists, and management of a data reduction group. When I left NOTS, I was head of the assessments division, supervising the work of 65 mathematicians, physicists, electronics engineers, and statistics aides, and evaluating optical and electronic data obtained in weapons tests. During those years, Alice and I read continuously in the fields of metaphysics, parapsychology, and theosophy, searching for and constructing a framework of ideas that would correspond with our own experiences and at the same time be reasonable in terms of a possible science in which mind and matter were not forever separate. I took it for granted and I would return to UCLA for further graduate work in physics. But as the time passed and information on sensory systems came to my attention, such as the excellent book by Frank A. Geldard titled The Human Senses, 1953, it began to seem that for the study of psychophysics, I would need much more physiological and psychological information. I possibly could get a PhD in psychology while gathering the information. that would be especially useful. Alice and I decided to find a position where we could conduct research of our choosing. Freedom is not easily obtained even with a PhD, but we were more fortunate than most research couples in finding a good situation in which to work. In 1958, we enrolled at the University of Chicago. Alice as an undergraduate student in psychology and I as a graduate student in biopsychology. One of our reasons for choosing the University of Chicago was that Carl Rogers was there and we looked forward to contact with him. He had developed a system called client-centered therapy, in which the therapist is essentially a psychological mirror in which the client can confront himself. One might say that the therapist provides psychofeedback in contrast to biofeedback. But when we arrived at the university, Rogers had departed. Behaviorist experimental psychology and positivist philosophy held sway. Having a philosophy of our own, we were able to take what was useful from the paradigms without being disturbed by their anti-humanistic orientation. The same could not be said for many of the students, however. Some were disturbed because of the conflict with their belief systems, and some we felt were depressed because of the conflict without knowing the cause. It is not easy to be a graduate student, and it is especially difficult in psychology if you feel that there is something wrong with the interpretation of humans that you are obliged to espouse in order to get a degree. The return of college was a challenge of the first magnitude. Although I was familiar with the elements of perception, it was necessary to fulfill academic requirements in biology, zoology, neuroanatomy, and especially in the neural basis of sensory discrimination. Going to school was also expensive. Not only were Alice and I in college, but our youngest children were high school students in the laboratory school of the University of Chicago. Fortunately, I was able to obtain a pre-doctorate fellowship from the National Institute of Mental Health, which helped our finances. I spent the first 2 years in electrophysiology laboratory of Professor Dewey Neff, helping his graduate students trace audio signals through cats' brains. These years of study and practice taught me that electrophysiology was a useful technique for mapping sensory projection areas, such as brain areas that respond to visual and auditory information, but shed no light on problems of mind and volition I wanted to explore. As Alice and I continued our own studies of metaphysical systems, it became clear for us the primary problem was not the classical mind-body problem. Is there a mind that has no non-physical characteristics, but that of will? Is there a force called volition that operates in the domain of mind? Volition, we have come to believe, is the key problem of our day, because control of the individual by society and by the state has taken away some of our own responsibility for our health, our education, and our activities. When Dr. Neff left the university, I was fortunate enough to obtain the sponsorship of the late Ward C. Halstead. His laboratory of metaphysical psychology in Billings Hospital at the university was justly famous for scientific innovation. He was a pioneer in studying the relationship between brain damage and associated psychological deficits in humans. My area of specialization, biopsychology, included the detailed study of the brain and nervous system, neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, and perception and behavior in humans and animals. My doctoral dissertation, 1962A, on pain perception in humans under conditions of sensory barrage, including vibration, noise, and flashing lights, clearly demonstrated that an important factor in the perception of pain is the focus of attention. When attention is directed away from pain, pain is not felt. Many people had experienced this, of course, but I was able to measure changes in pain threshold and relate these changes to measured amounts of distracting stimuli with subjects reports on their locus of attention as independent variable. Attention per se cannot be defined operationally, but as one professor remarked long after the oral examination in which I defended my thesis, we certainly know when we've got it. About once a year while attending graduate school, I thought about research on mind-body processes and wondered how best to begin a study of yogic type skills without arousing opposition before the research had a chance to prove itself. Then in 1962, a fellow graduate student in this department told us about a book he had come across called Autogenic Training, Schultz and Luth, 1959. The book was about a system of therapy especially applicable to psychosomatic mind-body disorders. Curious, the student had tried some of the techniques for relaxation and warming the hands. The results had upset him. The techniques worked. His hands got so warm and swollen that he couldn't remove his ring for several minutes. That was impressive enough, for none of his previous studies had so much as hinted that a person could control the temperature of his hand at will. But what truly startled him was a sudden and profound change in sensations from his body when he used a relaxation exercise for inducing a feeling of heaviness. Surprising body image changes often accompany deep relaxation. For example, many people experience sensations of floating just before falling asleep. We talked about the perceptual distortions that occurred, and I told him about some of the relevant things I read about yogis, such as their ability to control heart rate, metabolic rate, peristaltic action, movement of the intestines, and awareness of pain. This same graduate student was also a teaching assistant in one of my research courses and had considerable conversations with him about temperature control. I discussed with him the well-established accomplishments of certain yogis in Tibet who, even in the Arctic winters of the high Himalayas, need only a single cotton garment because they can control their body heat, called tumo, or vital heat. I also described the well-documented but not understood control of heat, which allows firewalkers of various lands to walk across a bed of burning coals without damage to flesh or clothes. The idea of firewalking interested him, but he found it quite unreal. His own success at warming his skin at will was bothering him, because the textbook said it was impossible and yet it had happened. What should he think? In any event, our interest had been triggered by what he had said about autogenic training, so we got the book and studied it. It was clear that we were reading of a system of Western yoga that, because of its medical origin, would be scientifically legitimate to study. Elmer's PhD in biopsychology was awarded in the spring of 1962, at which time I received my BA degree in psychology. I completed coursework toward a master's degree in educational psychology and counseling, including courses in a practicum in client-centered therapy, which was still being offered by the Department of Education. Courses under Professor Philip and Jacob Gazelles, authors of Creativity and Intelligence, 1962, a book based on their research, aroused my interest in creativity as a process. This combined with an interest in Oriental civilization and philosophy, augmented by an excellent course in Indian civilization offered by the university, led to my choice of the topic, Creativity East and West, a comparative study, for the master's thesis. My coursework was completed, but the thesis was scarcely begun when we left the university during the Christmas holidays of 1963 to find a new location in which to do the research we had planned. Before leaving the university, I solved a 100-year-old problem in visual brightness, discussed in some detail later. I also designed an automated version of Ward Halstead's test battery for evaluating brain damage. While working on the test battery over a period of months, he and I discussed some of the psychophysical energy concepts that had led me into the field of biopsychology. Eventually, we decided to establish a laboratory that would be devoted primarily to studies of the autonomic nervous system. the involuntary nervous system, which yogis reputedly could control, my research would start with a scientific evaluation of autogenic training. In order to get funds for this enterprise, I wrote a grant proposal for submission to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. After a long 10 months of deliberation, NASA turned down the proposal. Meanwhile, however, I began to think that Halstead's interests and mine differ considerably and that we would not be comfortable working together. Alice and I decided to leave Chicago and find a place where we could work on the kinds of projects in which we were most interested. Projects that would explore both voluntary control of the autonomic body processes and awareness of normally unconscious mental and emotional processes. We felt that such a place existed because I had already glimpsed it. 12 years earlier at Knott's, I had meditated on the question of where to work and had experienced a shortage hypnagogic movie. The grassy fields and the buildings where I could have a laboratory were clearly seen, but they were obviously not in the desert. My immediate question about where to work had the limited objective of determining what job to take at China Lake, but I had not specified this. If my question had been more specific, for instance, what would be useful to do immediately, perhaps the hypnagogic image would have been different. Ask a general question and you are likely to get a general answer. As it was, the green grass, the tree-covered hill, and the buildings and tall clock tower of the image I saw did not exist where we were living. If this image was significant, I felt at that time it applied to a future possibility, and I merely stored it in my memory. These buildings and the clock tower, it eventually turned out, were located on the west campus of Menninger Foundation. Perhaps the reader will ask, how is this possible? What happened, anyway? I can only report that in answer to my mental question, the image I described into my awareness that day. I can also report that the image was correct. The kind of experience precognition is perhaps more prevalent than psychologists realize. Certain kinds of perception seem to be independent of space and time, even though we may hypothesize that they are projected into space and time brain when they are consciously perceived. After we decided to leave Chicago, I focused attention again in the timeless domain and saw some additional views of the laboratory. Again, the institution consisted of a number of buildings spread out like a college campus over a grassy, tree-covered hill, but this time the large building with the clock tower, which could be seen from far away, was the most obvious feature. In one hypnagogic image, I went into the clock tower building and looked at a variety of American Indian artifacts in a small museum. There were also glass-covered cases containing manuscripts. In another image, my work was conducted in another building in which activity was coordinated by a highly respected older man who turned out to be Gardner Murphy. Much electronic machinery was involved, and though I could not see exactly how it was used, it seemed to relate to human behavior. A striking feature in one image was the appearance of small lines of light came from far away and converged on my forehead. Each line, my mind explained in a subsidiary hypnagogic flash, was a connection with someone in the country who was involved in the same kind of work as I. It seemed that there would be a network of people all over the country working in the same general area. They would be aware of one another and their work would be mutually supportive. It is possible for images to be wishful filling, of course, but in my experience, valid precognition images have a kind of certainty connected with them. This feeling of certainty and validity leads, at least in my case, to a feeling of, okay, let's see how the future unrolls. In this case, the images were accurate. The questions at the end of the 1963 was, where is that laboratory? We decided to start looking for it by going to New York City to spend the Christmas holiday with our daughter Pat and her family, then visiting labs on the East Coast and gradually working our way across the United States until we reached California, where we hoped it would be. While driving to New York, however, I began to think about the enormity of the problem finding any mechanical way the location of the lab. I suggested to Alice and Judy, who was with us, that it would be more convenient if someone at the lab contacted us and steered us in the right direction. In one sense, our feeling at that moment was very similar to what we had felt on our departure from England to across the Atlantic in our catch Daphne a few years earlier. When we set out from land, we had the sensation of leaving the familiar behind and trusting to our own continuous awareness in the present to lead us into all our future harbors. After the holiday season was over, while preparing to leave Pat's home, I received a telephone call from Dr. Philip Rennick of the Research Department of Menninger Foundation. I was surprised to hear from him. He had graduated from Halstead's lab at Chicago a year ahead of me and disappeared from my ken. I was surprised that he could find me because I had felt that no telephone number at which I could be reached after we left Chicago. Phil explained that he had received a Christmas card from another Halstead's graduate student, Jan Burkhout, who mentioned that I was leaving the university and was going to visit my daughter in New York and to look for a job. They knew Pat's name and the telephone company did the rest. Knowing of my experience in electronics, Phil's had suggested to Gardner Murphy, the director of research department, that I might be the one to help solve a problem there. The problem was not extremely difficult, but at that moment, there was no one here who could adequately bridge the communication gap between the biomedical engineers and the psychologists. Gardner Murphy wanted me to come to Topeka, Phil said, and talk about the possibility of joining the department. My response was that I would be happy to do so and would stop there en route to the West Coast. Phil suggested that since they were paying the bill, I might as well catch a plane and the next day and visit Topeka immediately. Although it didn't seem to me that the Menninger Foundation, which I knew was a psychiatric institution, would be a likely place to establish a psychophysiological research laboratory, I was intrigued by what Phil had said about bridging the gap between psychology and biomedical electronics and agreed to visit Topeka for a day. Phil met my plane and we spent an evening discussing our experiences at the University of Chicago. In the morning, he took me to the foundation. The closure between the timeless domain and the time and space domain often comes with a kind of jolt, a moment of truth in which time and space seem momentarily suspended. When I saw the clock tower on the grassy, tree-covered hill, it had a feeling of rightness. Nevertheless, I wanted Alice to see the place before I made any commitment. I met Gardner Murphy and other members of the research department, and we talked about the communications problem. Gardner offered me a job, and I realized that I would have a chance to build a laboratory and generate the kind of research projects I described in the grant proposal to NASA. Alice and I would be able to begin our own research. It was, to say the least, a uniquely propitious offer. They wanted a laboratory, and I wanted to build a laboratory. As a staff member of the department, I would be permitted to carry out whatever research I could obtain funds for. I explained to Gardner that I wanted to test the claims of autogenic training. Only 2 members of the research group had heard of autogenic training, but it sounded interesting to him, and Gardner felt that it would be an appropriate area of study. The important thing was that Gardner gave me the opportunity to spend at least 1/4 of my time right from the start on whatever I chose. In addition, he said, I probably would be able to work full-time on my own projects once the communications problem had been solved. Earlier, I had considered joining the staff of a university, but rejected this possibility because with a brand new PhD, I would have to begin at the bottom of the academic ladder and work on tasks that senior people did not want to bother with. At age 44, I had already put in about 18 years of professional development, but that might be of little significance at a university. Gardner was offering the opportunity to work on projects of my own choosing, and it was offered I could not afford to turn down. Kansas might not be the place where Alice and I planned to live, but California would have to wait.